Well, welcome to the 5th Galloway Glens event this season. We've been doing these events now for 2 years and everyone gets a little bit more complicated. But this time we've got a little reveal left over from the last meeting. So if anyone's at the Wild Woods of Western Europe, we did a little 3 presentations. And then during the whole presentations, there's a chainsaw carving going on. And
oh, yes.
it is. This has been completed.
Oh, gosh, that's amazing, isn't it?
Yeah, that's good.
So this bird's going to be going down to the Kakubri school tomorrow, and they're going to auction it off to raise funds for the Bar Hill Woods. So a great deal of thanks to Sam Boucher, who, pretty much did most of that apart from the colouring in the period of a Zoom meeting. So pretty impressive. And I called it a bald eagle during the meeting a couple of times. Very much as a red kite was it's finished though. So anyway, tonight we're leaving the woods and we're going to the edge of the woods now. And we're going to talk about grouse. And we've got 3 presentations. 2 of them are in the room here. And we've got one coming in from Edinburgh, I believe. But the first presentation is a guy called Ed Tooth. Now he's was the first Galloway Glens black grouse officer, get it right. And he was appointed in the early years of the Galloway Glens projects in 2019. And it turned out he was a bit too good for us because RSPB promoted him. So we had to get a second black grouse officer, Paul Anderson, who can't be here tonight. He turned out he was a bit good as well, and the RSPB promoted him as well. So we're quite good at employing good black grouse officers. But anyway, without further ado, I'd like Ed to come up to the stage and talk about what you've been doing in the early parts of your project and black grouse as a species.
Thanks, Nick. Thank you for that glowing introduction. So good evening, everybody. It's great to see so many of you here tonight and online as well. So I'm going to do my best in the next 25 minutes to tell you basically where we are with black grouse conservation in southern Scotland, but it's going to be a bit of a whistle-stop tour. So please, if you've got any questions and thoughts, stick them in the chat box online and we're going to have a discussion afterwards, of course. Always happy to chat black grouse with folks. So unfortunately, the reason we're here tonight, of course, is that black grouse are in trouble, and it's pretty serious trouble in southern Scotland. They've actually undergone one of the largest range contractions of any species, extant species of bird in Britain. So this is the current distribution, or as of 2010, from the BTO Breeding Bird Atlas. And as you can see, the populations are pretty much restricted to the uplands of Northern Wales, Northern England and Scotland. But it's only in the last sort of 150 years or so that we've lost populations from South Wales, from Wiltshire and the Midlands, Exmoor, Dartmoor, Dorset, Cornwall, Hampshire, Surrey and Kent. So a bird that was previously widespread and abundant across southern and western Britain is now, as I said, really quite restricted just to the uplands. And if we zoom in on southern Scotland, where we are tonight, we can see it's a similar picture of range contraction. So this is the map from 2010. If we compare that with the same map from 1970, you can see that we've lost a lot of the what you might call fringe populations. And again, we're really left with this kind of core. And of course, with a range contraction like this comes a population decline. So the time of the last national survey, National Black Grouse Survey in 2005, 807 lekking males were counted. This year, we're confident we got pretty good coverage, a combination of RSPB staff and volunteers and FLS, Forestry and Land Scotland, and we counted just 94. So that's a near on 90% decline in the last 15 years. And it's important that we put this into historical context as well, because actually, if we counted 807 males, even in 5 or 10 years' time, there would be some pretty serious celebrating going on. But actually, even this is just a kind of a scratch on how popular and how abundant they were. And we can turn to some of Dumfries and Galloway's earliest and most famous ornithologists to get an idea of how abundant they were in the landscape. So Sir Hugh Gladstone, who wrote The Birds of Dumfriesshire in 1910, and was also a key partner in founding the BTO, he owned an estate up near Thornhill. And he wrote an article in British Birds in 1937 about the decline of black grouse. And he talks about a carefully nursed beet. So this is his own estate. And in 1910, producing 336 black game and 350 pheasant. Now, when he says produce, that means shot. So black grouse were a quarry species. They were widely shot. In fact, they still are a quarry species, but there's a voluntary moratorium on the shooting. But 336, and this is one estate in 1 year in 1910. It's an absolutely staggering number of birds that just existed in the environment, and almost unimaginable numbers to us today. But in the same article, he goes on to compare the bag record from 1936, so 26 years later, when just 3 black grouse and 697 pheasants were shot. And this is a much more familiar number to us, both in terms of number of black grouse and pheasants. And he muses in this article, as well as a bit of a discussion in the Birds of Dumfriesshire, that he noticed a decline in the black grouse as there was an increase in the number of pheasants being released, and also anecdotally that there were more foxes in the environment on his estate. And we know nowadays that predation is having a major impact on black grouse, and the abundance of generalist predators that we have in the UK is higher than it is across most of Europe. So he was onto something even 80 years ago. And there was a bit of a reprieve for black grouse when the Second World War came along, and so for obviously quite tragic reasons, shooting pressure eased, and then post Second World War there was a huge demand for timber. So a lot of the southern uplands in the 50s were planted, and this created a flush of temporary suitable habitat for black grouse. For 2 reasons. So the first one is when you plant forestry, you remove the grazing pressure, either from the livestock or from deer or both. And that allows the vegetation that's important to black grouse to recover. But the second reason is that you introduce a different structural layer into the environment. And we'll come on to talk about why that's important later on. But for these 2 reasons, there was a bit of a population recovery into the 60s and 70s. And so the great Donald Watson wrote this fabulous little sentence in his book, One Pair of Eyes. So he talks about visiting parties of bird watchers coming to see the geese in the Kendee Valley, of course, where we are tonight. And these were the green and white fronts, which of course are the subject of another RSPB Galloway Glens project. And how they would extend their trips up into the high water of Ken to enjoy the spectacle of the scores of blackcock in the early spring feeding on the lemon and white flowers of the willow. And it's just such a beautiful description of what it must have been like. And he also goes on to note in his diary, he went up to see this himself on the 6th of March, 1960, and he counted about 60 birds in one morning, which is just, again, completely unimaginable to us. You'd be lucky if you saw a handful of birds up there nowadays. So that gives you an idea of just how abundant black grouse used to be in the landscape. And this is a slightly depressing way to get the evening going, and I apologise for that. But I do think it's so important that when we get the message out there about grouse, when we're talking about the conservation, that we understand just how perilous they are, just how far we've come, and how important it is that we now do everything we can to save them as a species. So, what do we need to do then, or what do black grouse need? Well, when we talk about black grouse conservation, when we talk about providing habitat for them, we tend to talk about it, providing it at 3 different geographical scales to meet the needs of the birds at different stages of the life cycle. So the first scale is the brood scale. So black grouse chicks, apart from being rather adorable, are precocial. So they will leave the nest as soon as they've hatched, and they will follow the mother around and forage in the local environment. So we need to ensure that we're providing suitable habitat for them on a fairly concentrated level. And we tend to think somewhere between 70 and 100 hectares is the sort of area that we need to be concentrating on. So black grouse chicks in the first 2 to 3 weeks of their lives are primarily insectivorous. So they've got a lot of growing to do. They need to basically fledge as quickly as they can, because obviously they're extremely vulnerable to predation when they're like this. And the richest sources of protein in the environment are insects, and particularly moth caterpillars and sawfly larvae, which we have there. The eagle-eyed of you out there might notice that this sawfly is actually feeding on rose. Rose is not a species we would advocate planting for black grouse, but I really love this picture of a sawfly larvae, so I thought I'd lob it in. But you get the message, because you can see that fat, juicy grubs like that, full of protein and nutrients that are really important for the chicks when they're doing a lot of early growing in the early stages. So research tells us that the chicks like to particularly forage in wet, boggy habitats. So these are habitats which tend to contain more coarse grasses and rushes, bog myrtle and crossleaf heath, which support important populations of these insects alongside blaeberry, which is also really important as well. And black grouse chicks will feed on a variety of other insects, ants and spiders and beetles. But these are really sort of, these are the most important. So as well as providing food, we also need to make sure we get the structure right, and the structure of the vegetation is just as important. So the females need long, tall vegetation in which to nest, gives them maximum chance of remaining hidden from predators, and the chicks need the same vegetation in which to sort of hide from predators again, and also shelter from inclement weather. But we also need to provide open areas that they can move through, so they can move through the landscape easier and forage. And we tend to think that this is probably the limiting factor on black grouse populations at the moment, that there just isn't good quality brood rearing habitat out there, because this habitat is really quite rare. So the next scale that we talk about is the Lex scale. So this is providing suitable habitat at black grouse for their home range. So black grouse, when they've settled at the lek at which they'll mate, they're pretty sedentary. They don't go very far. So they tend to stay within about 1.5 kilometers of the lek as a sort of focal point. So we need to provide, again, suitable foraging, suitable shelter within that sort of radius from the lek. And this, of course, includes brood rearing habitat as well. And there's two things we need to be focusing on. It's the field layer and the trees. So the really important plants in the field layer are heather and blaeberry. I should say this is a bit of a smorgasbord of delightful black grouse food up here. So this is heather and blaeberry, really important. And the grouse are feeding on the flowers and the seeds, the fresh shoots, the leaves and the berries of these plants throughout the year. But they'll also utilize a number of other flowering plants, cow wheat and cotton grass as well. Cotton grass is really important for the females when they're producing eggs. It's a rich source of protein, and grows in boggy habitats, which kind of coincides quite nicely with the brood rearing habitat. But so the field layer is really important, but just as important is getting trees into the environment as well. So species like birch, rowan, alder, willow, and hawthorn are really important foraging resources for the black grouse, and they will utilize the leaves, the fresh shoots, catkins, berries, flowers throughout the year. But it adds a structural element to the habitat as well. So it gives them additional shelter from predators and inclement weather. And we know there's research now that tells us, I think David's going to touch on this later, the research tells us that black grouse respond positively to the introduction of native woodland in the environment. So the final scale, and potentially where it gets most difficult, is the landscape scale. So we know that genetic variability is really important in maintaining any population, a viable population of any wild species. And it's the females that do the job of maintaining the gene flow in black grouse. So they will disperse into the environment and go seeking new leks, so that they basically try and ensure that they don't mate with males that they're too closely related to. So we need to make sure that there's functional connectivity between the leks in a landscape. So this means not only taking positive conservation management steps, but also addressing some of the issues that black grouse are facing in southern Scotland. And these come from the main land use pressures, anyway, on black grouse in southern Scotland, come from three sources, really. And the first two are summarised quite nicely in this picture. So commercial forestry and overgrazing. So I mentioned earlier that commercial forestry can initially have quite a positive impact for black grouse, but actually in the long run, it's bad news. When you get canopy closure, like you see in the background there, the habitat underneath becomes unsuitable. And we're also beginning to understand that the introduction of forestry into the landscape actually increases predator abundance in the landscape as well. This is drawing predators out into a landscape where they might not have been, and certainly wouldn't have been in quite such high numbers. So we need to be making really quite sensible decisions and looking on a landscape scale about where we're putting new forestry. And I should say at this point as well, and Nick mentioned my colleague Paul, who's done some brilliant work using modeling and looking at statistics and how you can manage large afforested areas like the Galloway Forest Park and ensure that there's enough blackgrass, suitable blackgrass habitat in an area. And it's really quite detailed, and unfortunately I haven't got time to really go into it tonight, but if you're interested, do get in touch, because it's really fascinating stuff, and it could be fairly groundbreaking, certainly for the future of blackgrass in the Galloway Forest Park. So the other issue that we kind of see, and this is a pretty familiar site in Dumfries and Galloway and certainly southern Scotland, is overgrazing, and it's a combination of livestock and deer that create this sort of purple moorgrass kind of monoculture. And again, you know, it just doesn't have that sort of species richness that blackgrass really require in that field. And the second pressure, or the third pressure I should say, is from wind farms as well. Now, the information, there's been quite a lot of research done on blackgrass and wind farms, and with mixed results. Sometimes blackgrass will happily leck around wind farms. There is also evidence that they get displaced, but they also will collide with turbines. So we know that there is an impact. And obviously we've got a lot of wind farms in southern Scotland already, and there's going to be more. We need it to fight climate breakdown. They're going to be essential. But again, a bit like the forestry, we just need to be having sensible discussions and thinking about it on a landscape scale, and about how that's all going to sort of interact with the blackgrass and the future of blackgrass going forward. So with all that in mind, what does ideal blackgrass habitat look like? What does perfect blackgrass habitat look like? And I've got a few pictures here to give you a bit of an idea. The top left photo is one that I took when I was in southwest Norway. I don't know where the top right photo is, but I really love the sort of sparse patchy distribution of the trees. And the bottom two photos are from RSPB Corrimony, which is in North Scotland. And as you can see, there's a really lovely matrix of low density trees. So that's the first key thing we need to be thinking about. And planting native broadleaf trees, as I said, is really important. And the important thing about low density, and it's particularly obvious in these bottom two photos, is the lovely field layer you get underneath, the species rich field layer that's so important to blackgrass. So planting native broadleaves, really important. But of course we need to manage that field layer as well. And the way we do that is through grazing. Cattle grazing is really important. And so we know that blackgrass respond positively to the removal of grazing in areas where there's been overgrazing historically, but actually you need grazing back into the landscape at some point, because otherwise the vegetation becomes rank, it will scrub over and it will become unusable. And in this photo that in Norway, top left, and both bottom photos, cattle are in these areas grazing. And this is another thing that we struggle with a little bit in the UK is integrated land use. And this is, to me, in my mind, this is proper integrated land use, because you've got productive timber, you've got cattle grazing, and you've got wonderfully rich biodiverse habitat. So tree planting, grazing, and peatland restoration, re-wetting areas, particularly important for the brood rearing, particularly important for creating areas of cotton grasses. But the photo in the top left, I'm actually stood in a bog there up to my shins in water. And the other thing you get when you're re-wetting areas is you get this mosaic of trees, because basically the trees can't grow. It's so wet that they can't establish. So you're almost creating this sort of lovely patchy network of broadleaf trees. But I should emphasize that this is ideal blackgrass habitat. This is perfect. And sometimes we can't always get all of this integrated into one area. So we would advocate the peatland restoration and the planting of broadleaves, even if you can't be doing them right next to each other, but as long as it's on the Lex scale, so within that sort of 1,500 metre radius from the Lek, you're going to be doing good things for blackgrass. Right, so that pretty much brings me to the end, but the last thing I want to do is just show you a quick video, because we're talking about blackgrass. Why shouldn't we watch a video of lecking blackgrass? Because it's just wonderful. But I found this video on YouTube and I just absolutely love the habitat. It was actually filmed in Estonia. And it just, to me, this is blackgrass heaven. And I kind of dream that one day we'll see blackgrass doing this sort of lecking in this sort of habitat in southern Scotland, and maybe even lecking to a lapwing as well. So I don't know, yeah, you can just play the video and just enjoy. So yeah, I hope you've been inspired by that very brief talk. What a bird. If that isn't worth doing everything we can to save in southern Scotland, then I really don't know what is. So my final plea tonight would be, if there's anybody in the room or out there watching and you're interested in doing work for black grouse, you're finding out more, you're a farmer, a forester, landowner, manager, whatever, get in touch, please, because we can't do this without you, without taking everybody with us. We've also got we've got two volunteering opportunities, always looking for Lex surveyors. So those of you that are willing to get up at silly o'clock in the morning to count black grouse. But we're also looking to establish some volunteer work parties in the Galloway Forest Park, doing some practical habitat management, implementing some of the work that Paul has been advocating for in his management plans. So if that sounds like something you'd be interested in, do get in touch, and my contact deals, we can get my contact details out later on. So now I'm finished. Thank you very much.
So, William, if you want to ask a quick question, fire away.
So they're a declining population of black grouse in Scotland, but what's their population globally like?
It's healthy but declining. So they're a red listed species in the UK, but IUCN, pretty sure, and somebody will correct me, but I'm pretty sure they're green listed just because they're so widely distributed. So you actually, if you head east and you go far enough and you hit the China Sea, you might still find lecking black grouse. So they're really widely distributed across. So that's the reason that there's not much concern. But pretty much everywhere we monitor them, the populations are declining for one reason or another.
A question for myself on that then, Ed. So if they're abundant across sort of Northern Europe into far Northern Asia, are those populations that are genetically quite different to ours? Are they doing different things? Are they living in slightly different habitats? And is that part of why it's so important to keep sort of retain the birds that we have here? Because our birds will be kind of specialized to our sort of climate and habitat.
It's a great question, Nick. So the British black grouse population is treated as a subspecies, Britannicus. And this is based, I can't remember when the research was done, but it's a long time ago, based on slight morphological differences. And there has been genetic studies done, and the last one found that they're not genetically distinct enough to be called a subspecies. So technically, they're all part of the same population, although, which is interesting because obviously, however long the UK has been separated from mainland Europe, and it would be really rather remarkable if we saw black grouse crossing the North Sea. So not genetically distinct, but I believe there might be some other genetic studies in the offing to find out a bit more about that.
Okay, we have a question coming in here from Zoom as well, from Charlie McGrath. Are there any predator management schemes at the moment with black grouse in southwest Scotland? I know we do a lot of this in Northern Ireland around curlew nests are monitored quite stringently for predators.
So as far as I'm aware, there's not any specific predator control measures for black grouse. So predator control is something that we would suggest as a management option, but really it's a sort of, we need to be focusing on getting the habitat right first. Predator control is almost like a supplementary thing, and the evidence of predator control working, particularly if you're just introducing it into an area where there might not be much predator control elsewhere, we don't know how well it works. So, you know, we would certainly maybe prioritize, if we're looking at management areas, we would prioritize areas, or we would use predator control as a prioritization tool. But really, our main focus is getting the habitat right in the first instance.
Those who want to watch it afterwards, someone called C Ride, no idea who you are, Mr. C or Mr. Ride, but there's a rural payments scheme included in the forestry management grant, which includes predator control. So there's an option to do.
So you can, it is an option, yeah.
For myself, if more questions come in, Ed will be with us at the end and can answer more questions. We'll have a little panel with the other speakers. And before we introduce our next speaker, I think what was something that's quite interesting I felt, and what you were talking about there, was the historic, the historic numbers of birds there. versus what we would think now would be abundance. So when he went up to that early slide where he had, you would think if we had 800 birds here now, it'd be great. Now I come from the world of fisheries, and a lot of the data I used to use started in 1952. But of course, the abundance of fish had actually started declining long before then. And when you started extrapolating old records on the river I looked after, you went from numbers of 4,000 or 5,000, 10,000 fish, and in the 50s, it's already down to 1,000 or 2,000. So we can, it's quite common across a lot of wildlife that the declines in wildlife been there for a long, long time. And, you know, we've maybe got a little further back in time to actually understand where we should be going. And our next presenter, he's all mic'd up now. I can see a little blue dot on his chest where the microphone's shining through. It's not a sniper, don't worry, Chris. The next speaker is a guy, Chris Rowley. Now, Chris Rowley used to be sort of a teacher. Then he moved to RSPB, and he was a well-known, well-kent face in the conservation circles for many years in Dumfries and Galloway. I worked with him on a previous lottery scheme, to what we're doing at the moment. But he's also got a passion of burns. So I asked him to maybe see if he could try and weave our national bard into a presentation on black grouse and black grouse habitats. And I think he's done his best. He's shaking his head at me now, but I know he's great at speaking and he'll enjoy himself. So Chris, over to you.
Thank you very much, Nick. I have to say before I start that is a complete lie. Nick just asked me to stand up and talk about burns and birds and conservation and burns as a conservationist. So that's what I'm going to talk about, because I have very, very little to say about Robert Burns and black grouse. However, I am here to speak about the subject. So anyway, thanks. Great to be here. Great to be anywhere. But I'll start off by saying, a set of dull conceited hashes confuse their brains in college classes. They gang in sticks and come out asses, plain truth to speak, and sign they think to climb Parnassus by dint of Greek. Ye may ye spark of nature's fire, that's all the learning I desire. Then though I drudge through dub and mire at Plure Caird, my muse, though hamely in attire, may touch the heart. So wrote Burns to his poetic friend John Laprake. I think it was on the 1st of April 1785, might be wrong in that. It was around then anyway, who lived in Moorkirk, and he was a fellow poet. And in that poem, of course, he bears out the fact that nature, as with many poets before and since, was his great muse. And lots and lots of words have been written about Robert Burns in many different ways, and including his love of nature and the position of nature as his muse, as his inspiration, and a chief inspiration at that. But nobody has written more authoritatively and more comprehensively on the subject than Sankerman and an old acquaintance of mine, John Young, who now lives in Dumfries. And if you're interested in this subject, whether you're online or in the audience, I can recommend no better and more comprehensive work than this book here by my friend John Young. It was published in 1996 by Scottish Cultural Press, and it is just the last word in terms of Burns's use of nature, birds, trees, plants, butterflies, insects, etc., in terms of his use of these as inspiration and using them in his many poems and songs. It's illustrated by Keith Brockey, well-known Scottish artist, and also by Donald Watson, who you'll all be familiar with from this part of the world. So I'm very grateful to John for the next slide, which he gave me many years ago, which actually bears out very clearly just how important nature was to Burns in his poems and songs. And John reckoned that second only to Shakespeare of the major poets, and of course Shakespeare wrote a lot more words than Burns did, but Burns was right up there in terms of the number of allusions to nature in his poems and songs. And we can see from this table that he mentions a total of 41 different species, and he mentions birds a total of 468 times in his poems and songs, which is quite a total. And as I say, right up there at the very top of the major poets echelon in terms of their use of nature. Not only did did he mention these birds, but he knew them intimately. He knew their plumage, he knew their habitats, he knew their song, their behavior, what they fed on. He knew about migration. And this is at a time when people thought that barnacle geese turned into shells in the winter and that swallows migrated at the bottom of ponds. Burns knew these species inside out. He didn't use poetic license or imagery with regard to nature, although he was a poet, of course. He was very, very careful to set these creatures and these birds in their proper place with the seasons. And crucially, and I'll come back to this, but he also, where he was ahead of his time, to my mind, is in his regarding of nature as fellow creatures, fellow earthborn companions. And as I say, I'll come back to that later on. And also, he had a very particular view towards field sports, which I'll also mention as well. So the first inkling we get of Burns and his knowledge and love of wildlife, and particularly birds, was in his Kilmarnock poems, the first book he published in 1786 in Kilmarnock. And it starts off, funnily enough, with a grouse, which Nick will be pleased to acknowledge. And it's in a song called, song composed in August or Now Westland Winds. And I'm not going to recite all of it, but in this poem, he sets a number of species absolutely perfectly in their context for the time of year, August, just at the approach of autumn, and also in their habitat. Now westland winds and slaughtering guns bring autumn's pleasant weather. The moorcock springs on whirring wings among the blooming heather. Now waving grain wide o'er the plain delights the weary farmer, and the moon shines bright as I rove by night to muse upon my charmer. The patrick loos the fruitful fells, the plover loos the mountains, the woodcock haunts the lonely dells, the soaring hern the fountains. Through lofty groves the cushat roves, the path o' man to shun it. The hazel bush o'erhangs the thrush, the spreading thorn the linnet. Thus every kind their pleasure find, the savage and the tender. Some social join and leagues combine, some solitary wander. Avaunt away the cruel sway, tyrannic man's dominion, the sportsman's joy, the murdering cry, the fluttering gory pinion. But Peggy dear, the evening's clear, thick flies the skimming swallow. The sky is blue, the fields in view, all fading green and yellow. Come, let us stray our gladsome way and view the charms of nature, the rustling corn, the fruited thorn, and ilka happy creature. And here they are. For those who don't, I'm sure you do know them, but we're starting top left, moving across to the right, then down bottom left, and then bottom right. And they are top left, the patrick loos the fruitful fells, the plover loos the mountains, the woodcock haunts the lonely dells. I hope the audience can see the woodcock camouflaging away there in that lonely dell. And I hope you can in Zoom as well, but there's a woodcock in there, I can assure you. The soaring hern, the fountains. Through lofty groves, the cushat roves, that's the wood pigeon. The path o' man to shun it. The hazel bush o'erhangs the thrush, or the mavis, as Burns calls it in other poems. The spreading thorn at the bottom, the linnet. And I should say as well that although we started off with red grouse, in Scotland in Burns's time, and indeed to this day in some parts of Scotland, the red grouse is called the moorfowl, or the moorcock for the male, springs on whirring wings among the blooming heather. And the moorhen, of course, is not the moorhen as the English know it today. The moorhen in Scotland is the stanky. The moorhen in Scotland in Burns's day was the red grouse, the female red grouse. Anyway, that's now Westland Winds. And to next question, was Robert Burns a nature conservationist, he asked. Well, I think with what I've just covered, I think that's almost a rhetorical question, because clearly he knew a lot about not just these birds, but many others as well. Nature was central to his thinking as he went through life, and indeed wrote his poems and songs. But of course, there was no such thing as an organised nature conservation movement in Burns's day. That was a wee bit of a luxury given the conditions that pertained in the countryside. There is now, because we've lost so much, as Ed just told us with regard to black grouse, but many other species have followed a similar trajectory. So in terms of nature conservation, he wasn't in the sense that we know it today. What he was a subsistence farmer. a tenant farmer of poor soils in southwest Scotland, but at a time of great improvement. So his day job, if you like, was a farmer. They had to farm successfully to get the family through the winter. And there were some hard winters and there were some hard times for tenant farmers and indeed for other buddies in southwest Scotland and indeed elsewhere in the UK at that time. So, but at the same time, he had an eye on farming. He was born at a time of the beginning of great improvement in agriculture. He was a bit of an innovator himself. He won a prize for flax dressing in 1781 when he was in the farm of Lochlee in Ayrshire. He was also credited with introducing a new method for dehorning cattle into Dumfriesshire. And he knew agriculturalists and for example, Andrew Meikle, who invented the threshing mill from Dunbar. He knew him when he was up in Edinburgh and met him on one of his tours to the borders. And of course, at that time, threshing corn was a mechanical thing that people did, that hard labour did. And there was Andrew Meikle, a friend of Burns, who introduced mechanised threshing. What a boon that must have been to farmers and their labourers back in those days, and indeed ever since. So nature conservation, slightly different term, but anyway, here is the area that we call the Burns country. And I include Galloway in this because he made several visits to Galloway, indeed to these parishes around us here. But of course, he spent most of his life in Ayrshire, in the middle of the picture there, and ended them down in the Dumfries coast in Dumfries itself. But also he made various tours to the borders, Scottish borders, to North England, across to Carlisle, out to the Western Highlands as far as Inveraray, and then what I would call the classic Highland tour, the short Highland tour up the route of the present A9 up to Inverness, out to the Banff and Buchan coasts and back down to Edinburgh via Dundee and Queensferry, etc. So he would see nature in those places and also farming as well. But of course, what the landscape was like and what nature was like back in those days is difficult for us to tell because we're living in the present. And as Hartley said, the past is like a foreign country. We really rely on information that's come down to us from people like Burns and other writers. This is a shot quite near here from Dalry Waterside Hill, looking away towards the Rins of Kells. Some of you will know it very well. But when Samuel Johnson came to Scotland with Boswell around the time of Burns, indeed during his lifetime, he said, I think he said words to the effect that trees were as rare as hen's teeth in Scotland. And he was only half joking because all of the accounts tell us that trees were very rare in Scotland in those days. For example, here, none of those conifers in the top end of the horizon there, none of them would be there. There were woodlands and these wonderful oak woods at Haniston and Garach in those days, but none of those trees would be there in Burns's day. It would have been older ones that have been cut down. But by and large, trees were very, very rare in Dumfries and Galloway, where we lost 98% of our native woodlands, and they're redressing that now to a certain extent, but more of that later. And also, of course, we are indebted to artists of the time who very often stylized their pictures as artists do today. Very often that's their prerogative. But this is Edinburgh at the time of Burns when he set off in these tours. You know, we can take what we can from these pictures that have come down to us, but they are very often stylized. So what did Burns say? Well, he set off in various tours. The most important one, if you like, in terms of commenting on the landscape and nature and give us an insight into him as a conservationist, was in his Highland tour, made in August, late August, around August 1787, just after he'd published his Edinburgh edition and made a bit of, well, huge fame and quite a fortune as well. And he set off in a chaise, and this is a chaise with his great friend William Nicol, who worked at Edinburgh High School, and they set off on the classic short Highland tour, if you like, up as far as Inverness, and looking at various landscapes, etc. And he kept a journal and he recorded various things in the journal. I have to say that he spoke more about people and their manners and habits than he did about the landscape. But here's some of the things that he said on the screen, and you can see for yourself that he commented mainly on agriculture, because he was a farmer in a time of great improvement. And these are sort of things you might expect of a farmer today if he's going through the country and looking at the different types of agriculture. So, but I can see from those few lines of agriculture by Burns that it must have been a fantastic place for nature back then. And that's part of the issue of getting to the grips with Burns as to nature conservation, because nature abounded all around them in this sort of farmland back then, with corn and turnips and lots of weeds, etc. All of that arable, without the intensity of agriculture that we know now. Nature would be everywhere, and of course it was. But also he was a poet, and he did enjoy the wild grandeur of Killiecrankie. Aviemore, he said, was a wild romantic spot, and these wonderful romantic margins of the Grampian Hills, which of course they are. So although he was a farmer, he was also a poet, and he did like a nice landscape when he saw it. And then we come to, this is the closest I could come to Burns in terms of modern day conservation, and indeed rewilding is a term that you'll often hear today. In fact, you just about hear it every day. But he stayed with the Duke of Atholl at Blair Castle for a few days, and he visited various policies. He didn't like them very much, actually, saw them as a bit artificial. But he also rode up the Tummel, and he also visited the famous falls on Brewer Water, the Falls of Brewer. And a few days later, when he'd gone further north, he sent back a poem to the Duke, the humble petition of Brewer Water to the noble Duke of Atholl. And in that poem, I'm not going to recite all of it, but he went to those falls of the Falls of Brewer, and they were bare. There were no trees or bushes around them at all. And he thought, wouldn't it be nice if the Duke planted these up with lovely native woodlands? And he mentioned birks and ash and lofty firs. Whether he means larch or whether he meant Scots pine, we'll never really know. But I think I do know, and I'll tell you why in a minute. But essentially, he implored the noble Duke of Atholl to rewild the Brewer Falls, if you like. And would then my noble master please to grant my highest wishes, he'll shade my banks with towering trees and bony spreading bushes. Delighted doubly then, my lord, you'll wander on my banks and listen, many a grateful bird, return you tuneful thanks. It's not much in the way of poetry to my mind, but the rest of the poem's there, and do read it. If we had time, I'd read the rest of it to you later. And of course, the noble Duke did plant up the Falls of Brewer. This is them on the left-hand side, and this is them as you might see them today, with all sorts of trees growing up there. Now, whether Burns encouraged them to do this, as the Wordsworth thought later on, I don't know. But what I do know is that the fourth Duke of Atholl, i.e. the one that Burns met and stayed with, was called Planter John, because he was a great planter of trees, and he is credited with planting 15 million larches in his lifetime. And he started long before he knew Burns. So, so whether Burns had encouraged them to do that, he certainly did. But whether Burns was actually playing along with the Duke's wishes in the first place, we might never know. Anyway, the Wordsworths visited there several years after Burns's death, and they wished that he'd planted Scotland's native trees. And don't we all? Birch, ash, mountain ash. But they agreed that by the mid-19th century, they would be a fitting monument to Burns's memory. So, so there we have Burns as a rewilder way back then. And of course, we have had some tree planting of our own, pretty disastrous for the most part in terms of nature conservation. I'll say no more than that. But of course, we know that 90% of them are alien conifers, largely Sitka spruce, not good for open country wildlife. Of course, agriculture has changed greatly since Burns's time as well. This is Glenafton, where I was born and grew up and cut my teeth in birds and Burns, as it happens. This is a hay rake in the picture there. There's no hay there now. There was when I was younger. The curlews have gone, silage has come, the corncrakes have gone, the conifers have come. They weren't there in Burns's day when he immortalised Afton in his Sweet Afton. So agriculture has changed since Burns's time, big time. The minister at the time of Burns in this parish said the numbers of sheep couldn't easily be guessed at. There were so many. So trees were very, very rare back in those days. Around the big houses, pretty much was their preserve. Elsewhere, it was pretty barren. Earlier in the Galloway Glens season, I gave a talk on Donald Watson and his poems and birds in a changing landscape. This was a slide from that. It's looking over Dalry, and of course, it was dealing with the loss of the change in agriculture since Donald Watson came here in 1952, and the loss of curlew, the loss of lapwing, and of course corncrake, which used to be found in the village of Dalry itself. So that change is ongoing. These losses continue. This was a picture I took just a couple of years ago within my cycle ride around Balmaclellan. This piece of ground in the foreground here was being improved. It was a lovely wet piece of habitat which had grasshopper warbler and sedge warblers, and I used to hear them when I cycled past. But of course, the season after this was done, they'd gone. And of course, this goes on around us, and the loss of nature is no great surprise to any of us who know nature and know farming and forestry. But in terms of an unequivocal conservationist, he certainly was in terms of field sports. He loved salmon, he liked to eat a hare, he liked hare stew, he ate all sorts of trout, but he abhorred the killing of creatures just for pleasure. He abhorred field sports. Many of his friends were field sportsmen, but in various, and I've just listed a couple of instances here, one from the Briggs of Ayr and one from a letter to Alexander Cunningham, but he really couldn't understand and abhorred totally the taking of wild creatures for pleasure, which he just could not understand, and it was against his humanity and morality. And also, just to kind of finish up, really, is his sense of place, where he really was, you call it conservation if you like, but it's this business of looking at fellow creatures and nature with a proper sense of place as to their right to be here. And the mouse, the Tea Moose, is the obvious poem that bears this out very strongly. Earth's, that me, thy poor earth-born companion and fellow mortal. Essentially, Burns looked at all of nature as fellow mortals and lucky enough to share this planet down through time. And I spent a lifetime in conservation and education, of course. And I remember periods when I was ridiculed and others were for wanting to preserve nature for nature's sake. Oh, you've got to do it. You don't say that in public, you know, that we're doing it for people because it's better for, and of course it's better for people, but also I feel an obligation to look after nature because we happen to share the planet with us. They have just as much every right to be here as we have. And Burns saw that. And it's not just because of Burns that I think that as well, but I think that attitude is pretty avant-garde today. It certainly was 200 years ago. And here he was, a tenant farmer with this sense of place, if you like, for nature itself. And he bears this out in a very, what I think is a very poor poem, but he wrote it after dinner following a quick walk up round Loch Turret. And I'll recite it to you from the screen in a minute. But essentially, he got up, he was staying with Murray in Ochtertyre near Crieff, and he got up in the morning, he walked up round Loch Turret, which is a bit bigger now because there's a reservoir there, but he put up some ducks, and up they got, and they flew away, and he thought, oh God, that's a shame. Went back and went and got cleaned up, and he went up to his room, came down, and for dinner and the assembled crew, he was a poet, he was expected to be a poet after all, and he recited this. He wrote it before dinner, recited it after dinner, and basically it tells its own story. But what I think it does is it gives this Burns' sense of place for nature, which must have been extraordinary at that particular time. And of course, he was right at the very start of the Romantic movement and a great influence on Wordsworth, Coleridge, Keats, and all of them. But here's what he said on Scaring These Waterfowl. Why, ye tenants of the lake, for me your watery haunt forsake? Tell me, fellow creatures, why at my presence thus you fly? Why disturb your social joys, parent, filial, kindred ties? Common friend to you and me, nature's gifts to all are free. Peaceful keep your dimpling wave, busy feed or wanton lave, or beneath the sheltering rock, bide the surging billows shock. Conscious, blushing for our race, soon, too soon, your fears I trace. Man, your proud usurping foe, would be lord of all below, plumes himself in freedom's pride, tyrant stern to all beside. The eagle from the cliffy brow, marking you his prey below, in his breast no pity swells, strong necessity compels. But man, to whom alone is given a ray direct from pitying heaven, glories in his heart humane, and creatures for his pleasure slain. In these savage liquid plains, only known to wandering swains, where the mossy rivulet strays, far from human haunts and ways, all on nature you depend, and life's poor seasons peaceful spend. Or, if man's superior might dare invade your native right, on the lofty ether borne, man with all his powers you scorn, swiftly seek on clanging wings other lakes and other springs, and the foe you cannot brave, scorn at least to be his slave. And there's Burns, you know, that sense of independence that he was famed for through his life and wanting to remain independent. There he's instilling that in nature as well. He loved the fact that nature was independent and it was on this earth, and we were traveling, hurtling through space and time together, and they deserved to be as well as he did. And just to finish off, this is a very romanticized image. It was painted by John Fade, a Galloway artist, and engraved by William Miller, and it was very, very popular in following Burns's time as the Cotter's Saturday Night, one of his most famous poems, came down through the Victorian era and went right round the world, where he romanticized, if you like, his father's cottage and what happened in the cottage after dark as they all sat down to eat dinner and then say their prayers, etc. And I want to just leave you with an example of Burns's, just the opening stanza after the dedication to the Cotter's Saturday Night, because it's very timely in terms of its imagery and an example of how he used natural imagery in the landscape to set the scene for one of his best poems and most celebrated poems down through particularly the Victorian and Edwardian eras. And it's set in November. It's November's chill blows loud with angry suck. The shortening winter's day is near a close. The miry beasts retreating for the plough, the blackening trains of craws to their repose. Thanks very much for listening to me.
Thank you, Chris. That was brilliant. Got a couple of questions coming on, which both you and Ed might be able to answer. So I'll give you this microphone, Ed, and it's actually referring back to conservation of black grouse onto. But firstly, the comment you said and Burns said about I've been involved in conservation all my life, and continually I've had to make an economic justification for raising funds to do conservation. And I've always felt that was pretty sad. You can't be a conservationist if all you're interested in is how much money you can make out of it. I think the state that we share the planet with all these things is critically important. Until we understand that, we can't understand conservation. So the question really was about stocking densities on moorland and farmland, which is at a level that comes from Joe Mitchell, chairman of Biosphere. So answer this question very carefully. She was asking about stocking densities and what's an appropriate stocking density on a restored peatland stroke moorland for black grouse. And
that's a great question. It would probably depend on what stage of restoration. So I'm no peatland expert, but peatland restoration is obviously a fragile process and can take a long time. So you would need to be very careful. And it really, we want to be assessing each site independently. So it's a bit of a shock. I've just appeared on the screen. Yeah, so you would do a habitat assessment basically and assess what was going on. So for example, if your restoration is at a very early stage, you know, if you've got delicate sphagnum mosses and stuff coming through, you probably wouldn't want to be grazing it too heavily. Whereas if it's quite well established, you know, you could get a decent stocking rate on, but you would, yeah, it would depend, and it would be site specific. Sorry to not be more specific. And I've noticed that David's just appeared. He might be able to add something to that about specific stocking density.
thank you. Do you have any questions from the audience on Burns, black grouse, etc. from so far?
I was just going to ask something about the type of farming they would do back in 200-300 years ago. They must have been growing crops. Well, Byrne said that. Wheat, barley, oats. The birds must have been eating all the crop residue as well.
Well, yeah, they would be. They were all around them, but of course, they had moss. Grouse would be in much lower ground as well. But it was all spring sown barley and oats and corn in those days. So therefore, there were stubbles through the winter, and they would plough not in the autumn, but they would plough in the spring. And of course, that then allows the bounty of the spilled grain and the weeds, etc., to provide food for all these passerine birds that we've seen decline. Well, chaffinches have done pretty well out the forest, but house sparrows, tree sparrows, yellowhammers, corn buntings, etc., reed buntings, they're doing not too badly. But basically, you know, our yellowhammers have gone in Dalry Parish since the crop rotation is gone. The last farm, Newfield, who did oats and barley, you know, finished when their baler, I think, broke down, and no wonder. They can get turnips now by the lorry load for you know, much cheaper than growing them themselves. So there's not the weeds between the turnips that we used to have, etc. And essentially, we've gone from a mixed arable component that Burns would have had now to having virtually no arable at all, unless you count silage as an arable, which I don't.
As well as habitat management, which I totally agree we need to do, should we also be doing extra winter feeding of grains or something like that? Yeah,
well, I do it in my garden, and millions of people across the UK do, and we found that birds like yellowhammer, for example, this was first discovered in Northern Ireland, where they identified that winter feeding was on a farm scale, and that's was having an impact, and basically they've got a fairly thriving population of yellowhammers now because they stepped in and provided winter food for them. So yes, absolutely. Sadly, the yellowhammers have gone here as a winter. I used to have them in my garden. Donald Watson would have a couple of dozen feeding on his seeds in the garden. But since he died and Joan Howie moved to New Galloway, and of course Newfield don't do their rotation anymore, we've lost them. But yeah, that would be the great, very, very difficult work. You know, and farming is difficult work. It still is, but it's a lot more difficult back then, though, when you're doing it for survival and back-breaking work as well. But it did provide a lot richer nature, of course, than what we have now, sadly.
Thank you very much, everyone. Next presentation, David Douglas is going to come on and give a presentation. But Maz, what you're saying there about mixed farming and the change of intensification we've had over the last 40, 50 years, and it seems to accelerate all the time. In 2 weeks' time, we have another event, Inspirational Thrive, where we're going to be talking about how we can try and put some of these ecological systems back in place, how we can have natural ecology working, probably not for the benefit of any one individual species, just for the sake of having a natural ecological system. Right, Dr. David Douglas, are you out there? Can we hear you?
Okay, thanks, Nick. Good evening, everyone. It's a pleasure to be talking to you from just outside Edinburgh. So tonight I'm going to be talking about the ways in which climate change might impact black grouse, and also what we can do in terms of solutions to try and mitigate those effects. Okay, so just a quick introduction to climate change, not that it really needs much of an introduction. It's in the news pretty much all the time. There's been a lot of coverage recently around COP26, but we can say the Earth is warming at an unprecedented rate. The latest data tell us that 2020 was one of the 3 warmest years on record, with a global mean temperature 1.2 degrees above pre-industrial baseline levels. A whole range of indicators like rising sea levels, melting sea ice, and extreme weather are all accelerating. We're seeing changing weather patterns, including more extreme events, which is something I'll come back to in terms of impacts on black grouse. And really, it's hard to overstate the seriousness of the situation for all life on Earth. So the graph at the bottom really shows the kind of temperature increases we've seen since the 1860s, really quite rapid in the last few decades. So I just wanted to start by just going through a few general examples of the ways in which climate change can impact on birds. Particularly these are relevant to black grouse, but I'm just going to use some general examples here in the introduction. So we already know that climate change is driving long-term changes in UK biodiversity across a whole range of taxa. And one of the ways climate change can impact on birds is through changes in the timing of their annual cycle. And so we know that many species, not just birds, but a whole range of species are breeding earlier with warmer springs, particularly across mid and high latitudes. But we also know that the rates at which this is happening can vary between plants, insects, and birds. And this can lead to mismatches. So for example, birds hatching earlier ahead of the peaks in their food availability. And this picture at the bottom just gives a sort of simple example for great tits. So the picture on the bottom left shows what the ideal scenario when everything is matched in terms of timing for great tits. So the blue line shows the sort of time at which they breed. The red line shows when great tit need the sort of peaks in food demand, both for the adults when they're getting into condition to breed, but also the second peak is when they're feeding young and they obviously need lots of food. The green dotted line is the peak in caterpillar availability. And so you can see under a sort of matched pattern, caterpillars are most abundant when they're most needed by the chicks. But the picture on the right shows what can happen in a mismatch scenario. So great tits, they nest earlier, and the peak food demand of the young, again that red peak, occurs before the peak in caterpillar availability. So this is a fairly sort of common pattern of temporal mismatch, and it's something I'll come back to in terms of impacts on black grouse. Another way that climate change can impact on birds is through changes in their distributions. And we know we're seeing poleward shifts in bird distribution. So birds in the northern hemisphere in general moving towards the North Pole, southern hemisphere, they're moving towards the South Pole. And this is happening on average about 11 kilometers per decade across a range of species. And we know that at sort of medium and high latitudes, which includes the UK, these responses are largely driven by warming of the Earth. And that graph just shows some of these general patterns in terms of northward shifts for butterfly and bird populations. And another form of change in distribution is altitudinal shifts, where birds kind of move to higher elevations. The evidence for this happening is a bit more mixed, but we know it's occurring, but at slower rates than expected. So there's a bit more we need to know there. But we do already know that it is causing some local extirpations of some birds. And so this is an example of a study from South America, but it quite neatly shows what can happen over time with altitudinal changes. So the sort of picture on the left, to the left-hand slope, shows bird communities surveyed in 1985. And on the right, it shows what happens when the researchers returned in 2017. They found that a lot of the birds had moved up the slope of the mountain, and for some of them, this had increased the sort of range that they were occurring at. But for those at the very top, they had been lost from that particular mountain. So, you know, elevational changes could benefit some birds, but not for those at higher altitudes. Another way that climate change impacts on birds is just through overall population changes. And we know that bird populations across Europe and North America are responding to climate change. And globally, bird population declines have been greatest where warming has been most rapid. And the bird responses to temperature, again, are greatest at intermediate and high latitudes, again, including the UK. But we know that most of these changes are due to sort of the way that birds interact with other species, for example, their prey, rather than direct responses to warming. So it's not the case that the birds can't cope themselves with the warmer temperature. It's the way it affects things like their own food availability. And this graph shows an example of the way in which golden plover can be impacted by climate change. So the yellow bars show population change on a yearly basis, and the red line shows August temperatures 2 years before, which can have impacts on, so warmer summers can have impact on their cranefly food abundance through a sort of lagged effect. And I suppose what the sort of main thing to take away from this is that the years when golden plover showed the biggest declines were generally those where August temperatures 2 years before had been warmest. So some of these relationships can be quite complex, but it shows the way in which warming temperature can reduce food availability of a key species in the uplands like golden plover. So now sort of moving closer to home and sort of starting to focus a bit more on black grouse in the UK uplands. We know that in the UK, upland breeding birds and seabirds are already being negatively affected. And actually, these are the two groups which are most vulnerable to future change of the climate. And this is very likely to be related to their more negative responses to warming temperatures than some other bird groups. And we know that after agricultural intensification, climate change is the second most important driver of breeding bird population changes in the UK since the 1970s. And over the long term, black grouse have been identified as being at high risk from climate change. But we need to understand why that is. So what will climate change look like for black grouse? So I guess using Scotland as an example, predictions suggest that Scotland's going to experience warmer, wetter winters with more intense rainfall events. And summers in Scotland are likely to be hotter, drier, with greater extremes. Although sort of, yeah, that prediction suggests they're going to be dry, that some other studies suggest rainfall has increased in most months. But I think the key thing, particularly in terms of summer weather, is some of these extreme events, and particularly high rainfall, which is something I'll come back to. And so sort of now moving on to the ways in which climate change can impact on black grouse. So firstly, in terms of their distribution. So this map, the map shows the most recent kind of national assessment of black grouse distribution from the BTO Atlas. But we do know that what's called the UK sort of climate envelope for black grouse, so it's the kind of the climatic conditions that are going to be suitable for black grouse, are going to reduce in extent to about 1/5 of their current range by 2080. And this is going to result in a sort of a projected northwards range contraction towards the end of the current century in response to climate change. So that map of distribution of black grouse is going to look very different towards the end of the current century. So with particularly the more southerly populations most vulnerable. And in terms of mismatches in the sort of timing of the annual cycle, so what evidence is there for black grouse? And actually, there's some evidence, but it's actually quite mixed. So there's certainly evidence of negative effects of warming for black grouse. So some work from Finland showed that warmer springs that mean that black grouse lay earlier and the chicks hatch earlier. But this study found that early summer temperatures haven't increased. So the effect is that chicks are actually chicks are hatching in colder conditions. So they're hatching too early, they're suffering high mortality, which has led to lower breeding success and population declines. And this mismatch in the timing of the hatching of the chicks, it actually explains their population declines in that study. Another study from Norway found that warmer summers reduced black grouse breeding success through some quite complex effects on bilberry plants and the availability of caterpillars as chick food for black grouse. But interestingly, some other studies have found some positive effects of warming on black grouse. So another bit of work in Norway found that the timing of breeding actually matched the peak insect availability. And that breeding success was highest when the birds bred earlier, even if the insects did not advance. And again, so breeding success improved in warmer springs. And yet some other studies, so from a long-term study from the French Alps, found that they found in that study no relationship was detected between breeding success and the winter and summer North Atlantic oscillations, which are large-scale sort of patterns in sea surface temperature, which can affect a whole range of weather conditions. So I think it's fair to say, in terms of advances in breeding and the potential for mismatches, there's definitely some evidence of negative impacts, but the evidence overall is quite mixed. And so in terms of changing weather patterns, in particular rainfall, what evidence is there in terms of impacts? So we know that increases in rainfall during the breeding season can impact black grouse. Their breeding success is lower when rain is heavier, particularly June rainfall. This affects young chicks. and this leads to reduced invertebrate availability for the chicks and can impose some higher thermoregulatory costs on the chicks. And as I sort of mentioned earlier, one climate study has suggested that rainfall across the country has increased in most months. So this does make black grouse breeding success vulnerable to heavy rainfall in June. And the graph at the bottom shows a published study showing so that how as June rainfall increases going to the right, the number of chicks per female declines, and that's the different lines show results from two different studies, but so the effects are fairly consistent there. So black grouse are also vulnerable to other types of weather, not just June rainfall. They're vulnerable to extreme weather events, particularly in the winter. And we know that heavy snow can increase mortality, for example, in two of the extreme years which occurred about 10 years ago. But interestingly, the vulnerability of black grouse to these extreme cold and snowfall varies geographically across the UK. So the graph shows how two different study populations, how their annual population change relates to the number of snow days over the winter. So the red line shows population in north of England. So in years where there's more snow days, annual population change is more negative. But in the Scottish Highlands, that's the green line, population change actually shows no real association with how harsh the winter is. And this is thought to be because there's less woodland cover in the north of England study area and more across the Highlands. And woodland therefore has a sort of important effect in buffering black grouse from some of the extreme winter weather events. And then so moving on to altitudinal changes and what evidence there might be for black grouse. So this graph shows results of a study looking at population change in black grouse in Scotland over a 10-year period between 1995 and 2005. And I think the key thing to take away from this graph is that populations were most stable. There were some relationships with habitat, but in particular, the populations were most stable at higher altitude. So the analysis predicted that populations were only really stable or increased above about 650 meters elevation. So, quite high in terms of black grouse. So this could suggest that conditions at lower elevations are becoming less suitable for black grouse. Okay, so for the final part of the talk, I just want to cover some of the solutions that we might have to help black grouse in a changing climate. And I suppose the important point here is that we can't alter some of these, these large-scale processes like weather patterns, at least not quickly through any of the sort of current steps that we're taking. So we need to focus very much on the things that we can alter and see whether these can potentially offset some of the negative impacts of climate change. So the first case study I wanted to talk about is a bit of work that was done in Wales. This is focused around sort of site-based mitigation for black grouse. So this is the results from a Welsh black grouse recovery programme. And this recovery programme delivered habitat management with the aim of improving productivity for black grouse. Predator control, in particular foxes and crows, also took place on some of the sites, which allowed the testing of the combined effects of habitat management and predator control. And the results are that productivity was lower when June rainfall is higher. So that's consistent with what we already know for black grouse. Productivity was also higher when there was a better quality field layer vegetation, particularly that delivered by habitat management. Predator control was found to reduce chick mortality during years of high rainfall, but when there was no predator control, rainfall did have a negative impact and it reduced chick survival. The key thing here is that when predator control was instigated, rainfall had no significant impact on breeding success. And when they're looking at the results for habitat management, it did increase breeding success, but only in the presence of predator control. And in the absence of predator control, habitat management appeared to have little or a weak negative effect on productivity. And these graphs illustrate some of these results. The two pictures at the top show the patterns that were found in in the absence of predator control. So the graph on the left shows how the number of chicks per hen related to June rainfall. And you can see that as June rainfall increases, in the absence of predator control, the number of chicks per hen gets lower. And the panel on the top right might take a little while to get your head around, but basically the darker shading is where black grouse were able to raise more chicks per hen. And I guess the key thing to take away from this is in the absence of predator control, productivity is very low, regardless of how much habitat management is delivered. And then the two panels at the bottom show the patterns that were found when predator control was delivered. So the graph on the bottom left shows that generally there's very little pattern of between the number of chicks per hen and the amount of rainfall in June when predator control is delivered. And the graph on the right, so the panel on the bottom right really essentially shows that when predator control was delivered, it enables the birds to benefit from increased amounts of habitat management. And so how could, in this study, how could predator control provide benefits for black grouse? So we know that high rainfall is likely to reduce invertebrate availability, which is likely to mean that black grouse chicks are in poorer condition. This might lead to them foraging in more risky locations, for example, shorter or sparser vegetation, which could make them more obvious to predators. And so, this is where the benefits of predator control come in reducing that susceptibility to predation. It would also explain why the benefits of habitat management were maximised at sites with predator control. And then in wet conditions where predator abundance might also be high, chicks are less able to trade off that higher risk of detection and predation when they're foraging in shorter or sparser vegetation, which they need to trade off against the risk of starvation or hypothermia. Obviously, they need to keep on foraging, even if they might be exposing themselves to the risk of predation. But I suppose it's worth noting, so this study does provide evidence that predator control could offset the negative impacts of climate change, particularly June rainfall. But I suppose it's worth noting that predator control is expensive and labour intensive, and it's quite a controversial technique as well. Now, the second example I wanted to give, it doesn't directly address the negative impacts of climate change, but it's another way of providing benefits for black grouse, and it's through providing the right kind of habitat for them. And so this is evidence that comes from study in Perthshire, using long-term data from the Perthshire Black Grouse Study Group. And the curve to the left of the red line shows the population decline up to about 2002, which was driven by maturation of commercial conifer forestry. But it's the increase to the right of the red dotted line that's a particular increase. So they showed a 90% increase over about 10 years. And the study that was conducted wanted to try and work out what had driven that increase. And in particular, the study tested the role of new native woodlands that had been created across the Perthshire study area under a range of grants. And these new native woodlands have quite open tree stands, and they're usually fenced in the early stages to exclude grazers, which could lead to recovery of the field layer. So the field layer and the open tree stand could provide benefits to black grouse. And so to test it, the study was conducted across about 700 square kilometres, involved mapping habitats right across the site and undertaking measurements of the field layer, and then looking for whether new native woodland was associated with black grouse lek location, the size of leks, and changing lek size over time. And they look for effects in a range of radiuses around the leks. And there's a lot of results here, but the key ones to take away are just those ones which are boxed in red. And so firstly, in terms of where leks were located, the study found that they were more likely to be found where there was a greater amount of edge habitat of new native woodland within about 1,500 metres of a lek. Secondly, leks were larger where there was where there was a greater area of new native woodland within 1,500 metres of leks. But the key result was that the increase in lek size was greatest where there was about 30% new native woodland cover within 1,500 meters of Lex. So that's about 2.1 square kilometers of native woodland within 1.5 kilometers of Lex. But a really important point is that these benefits of new native woodland were greatest when the woodland plantation was young, so about 5 years old. As the woodland matured, the benefits of black grouse reduced, and after about when the woodlands were after about 20 years old, Lex actually declined in size. So what are the potential benefits of new native woodland? So I think they're probably twofold. It's particularly in terms of the field layer, it's likely to be taller and denser than grazed moorland. I'd like to have more heather and blaeberry. But why? And it's also, I guess, relating to the presence of trees as well, and some of the effects I talked about in terms of buffering against winter weather. But why do the benefits decline with increasing woodland age? So it could be due to canopy closure. It could also be that the predator community increases over time as the woodland ages. And so in terms of summary of the native woodland study, so yeah, Lek growth was greatest when you have about 30% new native woodland surrounding Lek. So I guess an important point is that it's not just new native woodland, it's important to retain open ground around Leks as well. But the growth of Lek size was greatest in the youngest woodland, so some ongoing management might be needed to maintain the benefits. There's some wider implications of that particular bit of work in terms of woodland expansion policy. So Scottish Government has ambitious targets for creating new woodland. This could benefit black grouse, particularly in the early years of creation, and of course, should also fulfill a key objective of sequestering carbon. But I guess it's worth pointing out, whilst there are benefits of this book for black grouse, it doesn't directly address their susceptibility to climate change. So there are other solutions that could be deployed, which I wasn't able to talk about tonight. So for example, ensuring a network of protected areas to enable species range change due to warming. We know that a network of protected areas can result in fewer local black grouse extinctions in protected areas than they suffer outside, especially at the southern range margin, which is most vulnerable to climate change. We also know that landscape availability of semi-natural habitat can reduce the susceptibility of populations to climate change effects. Also for black grouse, other important solutions we should be looking at are correct siting of woodland, grazing moorland with appropriate densities, and of course also fence marking. So just to summarise, black grouse are vulnerable to climate change, particularly things like changing weather patterns, and with some evidence for changes in the timing of their breeding. There's also some evidence that populations at lower altitude are most vulnerable. We can increase resilience through some management. So for example, we can negate the impacts of June rainfall through predator control, but it is very expensive and labour intensive. There are other solutions can provide benefits, for example, native woodland creation, although they don't directly address the impacts of climate change. So a key point is, we need to be also looking at, the really important global solutions like reducing emissions, following the mantra that prevention is better than trying to cure the problems that come at a later stage. So thank you for listening.
We've got a few questions that have come in, Dave, so if you could hang around there. We're going to have to do a little bit of jumping between the microphones and what have you. So I'm just going to sit here and the camera will probably go over to Chris and Ed at the same time. So if maybe the three of you can maybe look at some of these questions. I will start off with one of the things you mentioned there about our black grouse intrinsically having problems with climate change. And Charlie from Northern Ireland has suggested, could you introduce grouse from areas which are already adapted to the new climate we expect to improve the genetic diversity of black grouse? Do you want to go first, David?
Oh, I mean, that's a tricky one to answer. I mean, there has been some translocation of black grouse. I haven't really had any involvement in it. I suppose you'd be making a very big assumption that you're going to be bringing in grouse that really are adapted to the local conditions, which I don't know if that would be the case. So I think that'd be a pretty tricky solution to advocate, I think.
Chris, would you like to maybe follow up on that?
I don't think I have anything further to add other than what David said. Yeah.
Yeah, and all I would say is that there have been many reintroductions of grouse in various parts of the world, and very, very, very few of them have had any success. So, and you know, where predators are a big part of the scene, then you know, predators take prey, and you know, the more prey you bring in.
Yeah, going forward on that, on Chris Ryder, I think his name is, has been talking about planting woods and carbon sequestration and mixing that up of understanding what that means for black grouse. I think some of it was answered, Dave, by yourself. I suppose, how do we influence the planners to plant the woods in the right places and to ensure that black grouse and carbon sequestration can be done together? I guess some of the answer could be in peatland restoration, which is good at carbon sequestration. Ed.
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's a tricky decision. Well, it's a decision that is we're staring down the barrel, particularly because of where we are with black grouse, and if we're going to make serious efforts to conserve them in southern Scotland, then yeah, we're going to have to make some tough decisions about where we plant non-native conifers anyway. But of course, that's not the only solution to sequestering carbon, and I would echo what David said at the end of his talk there, that yeah, the focus should be just as much on reducing emissions as it would be to sort of sequestering carbon in the long term. So we do have to strike a balance, and whether that's the Scottish Government regulators that sort of take a lead on that, I don't know.
David, do you want to add to that?
I'm struggling to hear Ed's answer a little bit, but I guess looking at the question in terms of design of native woodlands, I mean, I guess some key things are the planting density. So black grouse, I like, because they're a bird of they're kind of fringe between open ground and woodland. They're likely to do better where there's lower planting densities. But I think a key thing is, which I think they sort of learned from the Perth study, is that yes, black grouse will benefit in the early years, but particularly the field layer, you do need to keep that sort of dynamic and managed. If you fence the area and leave the plot for for several decades, that field layer, which is really crucial, is good. The benefits are going to drop off. So I think that's just as important as what happens to the trees.
Thanks, David. Is there any questions from the audience? I got one from a couple of questions coming from the audience. If you just ask one question, not a follow-up until the microphone comes to you.
Right, thanks. An observation really there's been a lot of comment about woodland, natural native woodland plantation and so on and so forth. Every study that I'm aware of on black grouse success and productivity, it's always been based on open ground. And I know that the study that SNH proposition around about 2014, it really highlighted the fact that for going forward, black grouse conservation needed to be focused on areas of moorland and acid grassland, and the larger the better. That combined with targeted predator control, they viewed as the way to go forward, and that was SNH. Just harking back to earlier points about habitat, when I worked for Forest Enterprise Scotland, and we took Dr. Phil Warren around some of our better areas for black grouse in the Galloway Forest Park, he was very impressed with the habitat that we had. And he sort of lent to the theory that this helped to explain why our brood counts historically in Galloway Forest Park were so good compared to where he was in the Northern Pennines, where they could look after their old birds because they had so many gamekeepers, but the productivity for chicks was terrible. In Galloway, we could really produce the chicks because the habitat was there, but we're losing the adult birds because they were getting eaten. And just quickly on stocking density, I would suggest it's not so much the density and how many stock you have on, it's the timing and duration. And if you refer back to regenerative farming, which is quite the thing just now, it's all about getting your stock on at the right time. Intensive grazing is a great thing. Just get it done at the right time so they're not eating the wrong things at the wrong time and poaching at the wrong time. And of course, cattle, cowpats, sawfly larvae, it's all good.
I think actually looking at grazing patterns is something we need to all look at. And in the wild, herbivores do graze quite intensively for short periods of time in places. Maz, you had a question.
Yeah, it actually follows from what was just said there. And Ed mentioned it earlier. It's about the importance of cattle grazing, probably in the winter as well as in the summer, the importance of cowpats. And I wondered whether, particularly for the last speaker there, whether the habitat management work in Wales and Perthshire had actually put cattle back on the ground.
David, because you're most complicated to get back into the room, and then we'll get Ed and Chris to pick bones out of those statements.
Yeah, so in terms of the Welsh and the Perthshire study, I suspect, I wouldn't want to say for definite, I suspect that any grazing was mainly going to be by sheep, particularly in the Wales study. In Perthshire, a lot of the woodland plots were actually ungrazed because they'd been fenced to allow either natural regeneration or the saplings to take, so that they were deliberately, grazing was deliberately excluded.
Ed, Chris?
Yeah, well, I mean, we just don't have a cattle and woodland culture in this country. They have it in France and many other parts of Europe, and also they have a far better hierarchy of both herbivores and predators. Such that we've got waders in Finland and Estonia, curlews breed in woodland areas because there's a hierarchy of predators. We don't have that here, but what we do have is as you know, Maz, is we have hard Sitka edges up against fences with rank vegetation for a few meters between the fence and with no cattle, and also there's a sort of zero tolerance policy. I mean, deer are a big issue in many parts of Scotland, but one of the issues in parts of the Forest Park here now are that they're shot in sight, and there's the natural herbivores are not there in the way that they were. As I say, there's a zero tolerance, and you can understand why, because they damage commercial trees. But basically, we've got the whole ecosystem out of sync in so many different ways, and previous speakers have just touched on some aspects of that. It's a complicated picture, and it's complicated in terms of black grouse because they eat so many different things. They need so many different parts of the jigsaw to be in place. We've seen at the Pennines, as David described, fantastic reduction in predators by the gamekeepers, but the habitat's all out of sync. There's no trees there, there's no cover, and if there comes heavy snow, there's nowhere for them to eat birch, and they can't get to the ground, so their survival is very poor, etc. And we just need to take a far more holistic, and I think that's what you're getting at in terms of cattle and the introduction of cattle into managing habitats. We don't do it nearly well enough, and we certainly don't do it as well as they do in many parts, in fact most parts of the continent that you want to travel to. And yes, I also think we do need a better hierarchy of predators in this country, because that is completely out of sync as well. I mean, the numbers of foxes, and I love foxes, but we're overrun with them because they have no predators apart from the few folk who shoot them, and I don't like shooting anything, but we're in a pretty dire situation in terms of the health of our ecosystems generally, but especially for a bird like black grouse, which is on the edge in so many different ways, including climate, as David described.
One of the comments made by JD in the Zoom room is it a crisis of predation or a crisis in lack of diversity and predators, which I think is what you're alluding to there.
Yeah.
Okay, we're going to wrap up very shortly. We've got one last question or comment from Chris, and I kind of sort of agree with some of this myself. Even I'm not allowed to have an opinion as a compare, but I'm going to. Is the climate crisis overshadowing a biodiversity crisis? My own view, I don't know what the speakers feel, is that in the minds of policymakers, it probably is. But of course, it's one and the same thing. And it's kind of very difficult for a human to live and breathe on a planet which has no biodiversity. So they're the same crisis. Any comments, David?
Well, I agree. You can't really separate them. A lot of what we call, the critical life support systems on Earth, rely on biodiversity to provide it, in terms of, the way that the oceans, taking carbon dioxide and give out oxygen, and same thing on Earth. It's all due to, to living beings doing that. Other critical things, pollination relies on, pollination of our food relies on biodiversity. So you can't separate the two, really.
We're drawing to a close, but I need to Chris and Ed. Would you like to follow up on that?
I would just very briefly, I think that, I mean, both world wars, I wasn't present at any of them, but what happened was there was a sort of contraction. People needed families, they needed friends, and they needed the environment. And the great nature conservation drive that came after the war, with all of those environmentalists that came, they came then, and they came because people at war and people who were going through war wanted to get back to nature. They loved nature, they loved families, but nature was part of it. And the drive to national nature reserves and protected areas came from the Department of Health. It was self-evident that we needed nature. And I think that we've just seen the same coming through the pandemic as well, when people realized, and to a certain extent through foot and mouth as well, but we're part of it. You know, we can't separate ourselves from it. Biodiversity is us, we are biodiversity. We're on the planet together. And it sounds very hippie and sort of 60-ish, but it's actually true. And we lose that connection, whether it be an aquarium in the corner or even just putting people in front of trees or pictures of trees. We somehow respond to it, and we get better because of it. So I think it's indivisible. And I think we take our eye off biodiversity at our peril.
I think way behind the population. Now, I've got one last thing which I'd like you, Ed, to answer. I think a simple answer. Charlie McGrath, how do we find out more volunteering opportunities? So quickly, I will put the answer into the reply to everyone that's joined this meeting with contact details and everything. But Ed, would you like to say something?
Yeah, absolutely. Send me an email. So as I said in my talk, the two main volunteering opportunities we would offer is Lex surveying and practical habitat management in the Galloway Forest Park. But if you have any thoughts, or just get in touch with me and we can chat more about it.
That's great. Well, we're going to close the meeting down in a second or two. But sorry, I was. Yeah, but if you could, everyone unmute themselves on Zoom, and perhaps clap out the way we normally do.